So yeah, I'll just do a brief intro to those of us who are new to this cycle of stories that I'm doing, and also this is the first time that I'm doing this only on Zoom with no live audience in the room. So it's a new medium, and so thanks for your extending of grace to me from the beginning. I appreciate it. Um, So this Arthurian Year project um, is a ongoing performance practice, because in the way that I've come to understand storytelling, particularly through the work of Dr. Martin Shaw and my teacher Andreas Kornvall, is, there's a way in which you can only really learn a story on your tongue. That there's that's the place of study, and so this project really has been about that kind of practice, leaning into that practice of learning stories in the act of telling them. And for the process, I've decided, or it was decided in the way that it is. At the end of 2021, I kind of had this bolt of lightning while sitting at my sit spot. The place that I was going in my home place before, where I moved to now, almost every day to spend time and pay attention, and got this kind of bolt of inspiration that I had been practicing as a storyteller, and kind of mostly looking at stories from my ancestral homelands, but much more broadly, just kind of tapping into whatever stories popped up, felt like they had something in them that I couldn't turn away from, kind of from all over the swath of where my people are from before they came to Turtle Island as settlers and colonizers. And as a practice of trying to understand some of the deeper moving currents in the archetypal, ancestral, trauma, grief, imaginal landscape of the people who get me to where I am now. And that had been my practice, and this insight was, to spend the next year diving into a single realm, a single corner of the realm of the imagination, a cycle of stories, and to really see what could happen in the process of apprenticing myself to a bigger arc, something epic with many facets, and also stories that I had never heard told out loud before. A lot of the stories that I was telling were ones that I had learned through direct oral transmission, and I'm getting an internet connection unstable, so that's just the way that it goes. And it kind of dawned on me, really guided by something that I have heard Marie Louise von France say, who's a Jungian analyst, that the stories that really matter to you in your young life have something really to say about who you are, but also who you could be, what you're called to be. And so I kind of did some, in this really lightning moment of collecting data and sifting through myself, became really obvious that the Arthurian legends were something that's been with me since I'm a little kid. I was about 4, I think, when I was introduced to the stories, kind of in a child's playhouse in Santa Monica in a mall when I was 4, and there was just something really that grabbed me, and I wanted to understand that, and so here we are, engaging with these stories, and I didn't want too much agency in the project. I'm pretty controlled, disciplined person, so I wanted a spark of being out of control, and so I decided that instead of just look at a source and tell from beginning to end over the year, that I would try to come into a deeper understanding of the language of astrology and the movements of planetary archetypes and the ways that they coincide and make maps and nexuses of meaning, and then to try and pull out of that discernible patterns that then could be translated into stories. Like, what stories are in the sources that are happening at the skies at different times. And that's so one of the reasons why I chose to do this full moon timing on these story performances. And it then became a research project, and which I've just turned in with like a kind of theoretical manifesto of how I work with story, and what the findings in the process has been like. And here we are. This is the eighth one. So thank you. There's the preamble. And yeah, big shout out to Alexis for being my emissary from the cosmos. Or my son told me the other day that astrology is actually about dinosaurs. So I guess the dinosaurs are actually the sources of all of this, all of this information that is coming out. So thanks for the words, and I'm gonna just invite you to where you are, find your way to a grounded, receptive place where you could crack the door into another time, another way of being, another space, and a place where you could hear those emanations from deep heaven that C.S. Lewis talks about. A place where you could find a portal into fairy or the other world, just for this time that we're gathered here tonight. And breathe into that kind of space together. And as we kind of saunter into that kind of space, I'm gonna start off. I'm not gonna start in the middle. I'll do a quick jaunt through the story from last. Well, not too quick, but a jaunt through the story from last month, just to get us to where we are deep in the forest with the Red Knight or Parzival. So, in that case. Once upon a time, once before time, once under time, once in a time when we remembered that stars were dinosaurs, once when time flowed more like a river and ticked less like a clock, once in a time like that, once in chasm time, quake time, time of earth yawnings, the cup of trembling time, the wine of astonishment time, hell naked before me time, once out of the depths have I cried to thee time, I am a brother to dragons and a companion to owls time, I am come before the king of terrors time, I am sore broken in the place of dragons time, tempest and waters steal me away time, once upon a terrors take hold of me time, fearfulness and trembling are come upon me time, a wide breaking in of waters time, a wide rushing in of waters time, Gunungagap, a place, a once upon a time like now, because all time is once upon a time. In a time like that there was a boy, born into grief, in a forest in Wales. Just after he was conceived, his father was called away onto the Baghdad road and died there. And in the wake of the death of this boy's father, this boy who had been called Beautiful Face by his mother when he was born, his mother, sick of the warmongering, honor-obsessed, chivalric court took her son and a small group of attendants off into the Welsh forest. And their beautiful face was raised in confinement in the woods, in the deep, wet places of a Welsh wood, tracking foxes and badgers and marveling at spider webs dripping dew in the morning light. And in this world outside of the world of court, he had this beautiful childhood. Peppered with the grief, one time when he had heard the singing of the birds, he ran back to his mother, and his courtly bardic enunciation of the incredibility of the power of the bird's song reminded his mother so much of the court and of the power of the bard that the next morning she had her attendants strangle all the birds at the dawn chorus. We're in a deep grief place. And in this protected realm and in this forest, no emanations from the outside came in for years and years and years, until one day when Beautiful Face was sitting there alone in the wood, pondering some fern or some flower, he heard the stamping of hooves and the creaking of some metal off in the distance. And so he snuck over. And this loudness and the creaking of metal and the stamping of hooves called to mind the stories of demons that his mother would tell him. And so, filled with anticipation and fear, he crept to where the sound was coming from, and he saw two beings fully clad in armor sit upon massive black horses. But their armor shined. And when they peered out into the woods and they saw him, they spoke kind words. And all of this binary imagination of angels and demons that he had heard from his mother began to flip valences, and it was obvious to him that these must be angels. And so he dropped himself down in front of the two men on the horses and asked for their blessing and asked if they really were angels, messengers from God, here to talk to him. And these two grown men on these horses, to their eternal credit, did not make fun of this strange, beautiful boy from the forest, but instead explained to him that they were knights. And they explained to him some brief version of the code of chivalry and how they were the knights of King Arthur of the Round Table. And explained to him that if only he left the wood and followed these directions to Camelot, that he too might be able to be a knight, because the older of the two men saw something noble and something incredible in this face of this young boy. And then they were off into the wood. And so he ran to his mother, excited. He ran to his mother excited, and when he got to her and blabbed his stories about these demons, come angels, come knights in the wood, and all of this mystery of King Arthur, his mom's face became waxen, and all of the blood went out of it, because her protection, her confinement, this palace of isolation that had been created in this wood from the realm of the court, had somehow been broken. This vessel of the alchemy of their lives had been shattered. And instead of shutting down and killing the birds that were now fluttering in his chest, she then said, "Okay, but if you're gonna go, you need to take my advice." And she gave him a very twisted and tangled series of advices that left him riding out of the wood on the back of a donkey, dressed fully in sackcloths, and ready to do all sorts of strange things, including taking rings from sleeping maidens, and always listening to the advice of men with gray beards, this tangle of advice. And it led him on some strange journeys, including when he came to the edge of the wood and he found a pavilion with a sleeping woman whose name was Jesui. And he snuck in to see what might be in this pavilion. He saw this woman sleeping in her bed, and he saw the ring gleaming on her finger. And so he snuck in, and he attempted to take the ring off of her finger. And in taking it, she awoke, and then he knew not what to do, so he kissed her right on the mouth, and then ran away. And you can imagine the horror that played out in that scene as as this strange boy from the forest takes the ring of this woman, and we'll see later how this unfolds. But he ran away before dealing with it off into the woods, and there he saw another woman crying, holding the body of a dead man. And he spoke to her briefly, and it came from the mouths of this grieving woman as he talked about his life, and he said that his name was Beautiful Face, that his true name, and she named him Parzival because she, the woman Sigoon, there grieving over the dead body of her lover, was his aunt. And so he starts to meet his family by strange synchronicity in the woods and gains his true name, Parzival. And with this sense of adventure, like many young men have done, he leaves his grieving relative in the woods, none the better from having met him, and goes off on his adventure towards Camelot. When he gets to Camelot, he sees a red knight strutting around, calling out for Arthur to give recompense for some land dispute, and he had stolen this cup from Arthur's court. And the boy hears him lambasting Arthur and gets a little upset about it and sneaks by on his donkey, and it eventually rides all the way into the heart of Camelot, into the Round Table Hall, and right up to Arthur, the donkey's nose in Arthur's face. Through a series of taunts and boasts, somehow Parzival gets it in his head that he's the one who's going to go make it right with this Red Knight, and a terrible battle ensues, in which this untrained boy uses a foul trickery and shoots a javelin right through the Red Knight's eye, killing him. There's mixed reports. Guinevere lambasts Parzival, who's now wearing the Red Knight's armor after a comic scene of stealing it from his dead body. And instead of dealing with the words of Guinevere, he runs off into the woods, riding the Red Knight's horse with the Red Knight's armor. All of his buckles undone correctly, his shield hanging strangely off him, and no one knows how long he was in the wood, but he finally comes to the castle of a mentor named Gurnemanz. And Gurnemanz first sees the disheveled boy who knows nothing about armor, and then sees the nobility of his face, and takes him in, and trains him in the art of chivalry, makes him worthy of the arms that he now carries. And some time passes, and it's never enough time in the heart and the home of your mentor before you have to leave again, and Parzival leaves and goes off back onto the roads of the world. Through adventures and strangeness, he comes to a castle where he gets embroiled in a strange forced marriage that he breaks up between his wife, Conwiramers, who later becomes his wife, and this man from Ireland. He breaks up this wedding. He ends up falling in love. It's incredible. It moves so quickly. It's this mentoring, this beauty, this learning, and then he falls in love. And some months into the love, he realizes his mother's still off there in the woods, and wouldn't it be so nice if his mother would come here and be with him in his happy new home with his wife? And so he leaves, he tells his wife that he's going to leave, and she gives him permission. I think maybe he asks his wife if he can leave. I feel like that's more Parzival. And she gives him permission, and he goes off into the world to go find his mother there in the woods. And on this quest to find his mother, he finds his way into a bit of wood that he's never been to before. And it's strange as he goes into this wood, there's this feeling of waste and desolation starts to creep into the landscape and into his heart. And he's walking by fouled creeks and stagnant water and standing dead trees and dead fish and this emptiness and this quiet. And in the heart of this emptiness and this quiet, he finds a lake. And floating out there on the lake is an angler, a fisherman, with his pole and his line deep down into the darkness of this lake at the heart of the wasteland. This pure, clean, beautiful water. And night is coming as Parzival watches the angler there out on the lake. And they begin a conversation across the water, Parzival asking the angler if he has anywhere to stay for the night. The angler inviting him back to his home. And so the angler rows in and they ride together and they come to a great castle there in the woods, and it becomes obvious that this angler is indeed some sort of king as they walk in, and he's received his crown put back on his head. And as he gets into the castle, away from the waters, he begins to limp. And he's then carried and put into a hall. And Parzival is sat down in the hall, and then it fills up with people, and this feast is coming. And he sees that the king is sitting up there on a dais, on his throne, with a wound bleeding from his groin that never stops bleeding, this continuously festering wound that attendants come and tend to over and over and over again. It is said that they tend to it with pelican's blood and hawthorn flowers and strange essences from deep within the earth and all sorts of things to attempt to staunch this eternal bleeding. And then, in the middle of dinner, a smell, that one smell that reminds you the most of your deep childhood, enters the hall. And a light mist or smoke, an incensing smoke, enters the hall as the doors open and a procession enters. First, 2 twin 7-headed candelabras carried by angelic, gold-spewing young women. And behind the candelabras, a spear, a long spear whose tip drips and cries blood down onto the hands of the young boy carrying it. And behind that, a platter with a severed head upon it. And finally, in the back, the queen of this castle carrying a cup lifted above her head. A cup that when you saw it, you might swear you saw a white dove just alighted on top of it, emanating light. And when this procession enters the hall, the tables in front of all of the people are filled with any food that you could possibly have been desiring. Their cups are filled with the drink that you most enjoy drinking with dinner. And in the strangeness, Parzival asks no questions. He asks no questions. He says nothing. He says nothing. And he sees the bleeding wound. He sees this procession. He says nothing. And the king, the fisher king or the angler, he takes this silence as if it is Parzival telling him that his hospitality is just simply not enough, that it doesn't wow him. There's nothing magic here. And so the king does something strange. Instead of getting offended, he extends the hand of generosity, and he sends his sword to Parzival as a gift. And Parzival says nothing. He asks no questions. And when the feast ends, when they decide that it is better to sleep than to continue carousing, Parzival is led to his room, and he asks no questions, he just follows, and he's put to bed. And when he wakes up the next morning, the castle is gone. He is asleep. He has woken in a ruined bed, in a ruin, in a quiet ruin in the middle of the wasteland. And as he walks out and goes to ride his horse and rides out the gate, he hears, as he leaves across the water, the gate lifting and slamming shut behind him. And he hears a voice, that voice that we all hear sometimes inside of ourselves, but he hears it out there in the woods. And it calls to him, and it calls him a fool, and it calls him all the worst thing that you could possibly be called, whatever that is to you, and it calls out to him, telling him of his failure, how he was so close to the one thing that everyone wants to be so close to, and how he had failed. And the slamming of the gate ringed throughout the wasteland, and it entered Parzival what he had truly missed there in the wood, some encounter with something that everyone longs for. And so he rode off deep into the wood, into the darkness, alone, and no one knows how long Parzival was alone. But when he did come across someone, after years or after some time riding through this wasteland, with the only sound the scraping of the wind and the occasional muttering and scream of some thing in the woods, when he had grown accustomed to the smell of plants rotting in their flowering time, when he had grown accustomed to the sight of sickly creatures, of spilt blood being the only place of any vitality in the land, this strange waste of a wood, the first being that he came across was a gaunt and corpse-like woman, there crying tears that could not come out because she had already cried all her tears, holding the mummified by time body of a man in her lap. And Parzival doesn't recognize this woman, but instead of sitting quiet like he has all of this time, he rides to her and he asks her a question. He says, "What is wrong? What is your grief? Why are you here? Why are you here?" And she begins to tell him the story of her dead lover. And it somehow comes out again, he starts to remember. This is his cousin, this is his family, Sagoon, who he had met in the woods, who had given him his name. And there she is still grieving in the woods. And her eyes, the veil is lifted for a second, and she sees, and she looks up and she sees Parzival. She remembers him. And she asks why he's here, and he begins to talk about the castle that he spent the night in, and the angler, the Fisher King that he has met. And she sees his sword, the Fisher King's sword, hanging from Parzival's side. And she says, "You've made it. You went to the Grail Castle. You've been to Corbinick. That means you've asked the question, and you've healed the king, and you've freed us. Right, Parzival? You did it. You asked the question, and you freed us. You've healed the land." And Parzival's face goes ghost white, because he can't lie, because she wouldn't be here in her suffering if he had asked the question. And so he admits it. He tells her, I have been to the Grail Castle. I have met the Fisher King. Indeed, this is his sword. And I failed. I asked no questions. I remained silent. And uttering this confession, he is not met with mercy and grace, he is met with wrath. And she screams forth at him. She says, I wish that I was not forced to be in your presence. You have damned us all to this wasteland world by your inability to open your heart and open your mouth in the presence of the grief and suffering of the Fisher King. And she looks down and she refuses to look at Parzival again. And he waits and she refuses to look or speak. And in the grief that arises in him, he saunters again off into the wasteland, lost in the forest. In the weight for everyone else in the world of his silence. The next being that he comes across is a woman riding upon a horse. Her clothes are tattered rags, and she's riding blank-faced through the wood. And I imagine that Parzival is getting hip now, and so he looks more closely and he realizes that he is seeing Jesui, the woman who he kissed, and the woman whose ring that he stole, and he's seeing what has happened. And she's riding there in the wood, and she sees Parzival, and the veil lifts from her eyes for a second, and she looks at him, knowing what she knows, which is that the actions that Parzival took, the disheveling of the bed, the kissing, the stealing of the ring, all led to this that she's living in, because her lover, his name is Aurelius, would not believe the story that this beautiful boy from the forest had broken in and done these kind of strange non-consensual things, and that she had nothing to do with it. He wouldn't believe it. His fury and his jealousy and the stories that he had written in his own mind led him to condemn her to wandering the wasteland by her in the clothes that she was wearing that day for all of eternity, and he would be nearby. And she says to Parzival, instead of screaming, yelling, fighting, which I'm sure is all in there, but in this version of the story that I know, she says to him, you better go, because Aurelius is right around the corner, and he's out for your head. He's out for revenge, and he wants to reclaim his own honor. It's not even about me. He wants to he's created this story, and so he's in it, and he's gonna end you. He's gonna end you. And just at that moment, indeed, Parzival, in his red armor, the grief heavy on his face and in his heart, turns around, and riding toward him at full tilt, in gold armor emblazoned with dragons, is Aurelius. And Aurelius drops his spear, or his lance, and charges at Parzival to end this cycle, and re-inflict some wound to erase, to justify these years of suffering in his tormented story. And they meet on the field, and Aurelius is accustomed to winning. But Parzival, for some reason, Parzival is able to best this knight. Parzival hasn't been in that many battles at this point. He's able to best this knight and throw him to the ground off of his horse. And instead of getting lost in the heat and the bloodlust of this encounter, he looks at Aurelius after he defeats him, and he pleads with him to believe Jesui, and he takes responsibility for what he's done, and also pleads for the innocence of Jesui, and he takes responsibility for what he has done. And he tells Aurelius, who has just been bested, that he has to go to Camelot and spend his life in service to a woman there named Cunaware, who, interestingly enough, when Parzival was first at Camelot, he walked by Cunaware, and there was this prophecy about, she was a woman who never laughed. And there was this prophecy about when the best knight in the world entered Camelot, finally, that she would laugh. And the first time Parzival walked by her, she laughed. And they have this thing, every time Parzival bests a knight, he sends them to Cunaware, and they have to pledge service to her. And so he tells this to Aurelius, and Aurelius says, well, Cunaware is my sister. And so they go off, and on their way they stop at a hermit's cell there in the wasteland, this little enclosure, this enclave of holiness in this deep, dark wasteland place. And Parzival once again swears on the innocence and asks for forgiveness, and Aurelius gives it. And Jesui gives it to Parzival. And they give it to each other, Aurelius and Jesui, and there's some sort of mending in this relationship. And they leave the hermit's cell, Parzival back into the wood, off onto all other sorts of strange journeys and adventures, and Aurelius and Jesui towards Camelot. Well, they don't get too far. They don't get too far when they hear a great commotion, and they see that in a clearing some days' ride from there, King Arthur and all of his knights have set up a sort of forest wildling round table experience. They're having this great feast in the woods. And Aurelius and Jesui roll in. Aurelius's armor is completely rent and destroyed, and he goes straight to Cunaware, his sister, as he was told to do, and pledges his service. And it takes her a second to even recognize her brother, as he is so disheveled. And then he unfolds the story about how he was bested by the Red Knight in the woods, a few days' ride away. And Cunaware says to Aurelius, she says, well, that is, that's a coincidence. That is why we're here. Arthur has been hearing the tales of this Red Knight, and all the strange things that he has done in the wood, and all of the name he is making for himself, and has come to offer him a place at the round table. But no one can find him. No one can find him. And so a search party is sent out with Aurelius at his head, and they search all around the wasteland, all around what is called Wild Mountain, this forest that you only come into by invitation in some way, some invitation of the spirit. And a search party is sent out to search for Parzival. And in a myth, 2 weeks could be 2 years, and 4 days could be 400 years. But they searched and they searched through this forest, through Wild Mountain. Meanwhile, Parzival is riding his horse through the wasteland as snow begins to fall. So we can see that time here is passing. The winter has come and snow has begun to fall, and he's riding and he's getting colder and colder and colder and colder. And in this coldness in the wood that was already barren, but now is a tundra-scape, he sees, out of the corner of his eye, he sees quick movement, and he looks up. The corner of his eye, above the trees, he sees quick movement, and he sees a complete flock of wild geese in complete disarray, flapping their great wings in this honking cacophony, and within them, flying with quick speed and aerodynamic movement, a falcon. A falcon burst into the flock of wild geese and attempts to take one of the huge birds and hits it with its talons. The bird, the great goose, is able to free itself at the last second with an injury. And where the talons of the falcon ripped into the skin of the goose, 3 drops of blood form and fall into the snow in front of Parzival. And looking at the birds in the sky, the great black of the necks of the geese, and the blinding whiteness of the snow, and the red, the brilliant life-giving red of the drops of blood, Parzival is pulled into some sort of trance. Suddenly the black of the goose's neck becomes the hair of the love of his life, Condwiramers, whose name means guide to love. And the white becomes the whiteness, this perfect porcelain of the image of her skin in his mind, and the red becomes the scarlet of her lips, and he enters into a love trance there, staring at the blood in the snow. He's frozen on the spot in the frozen scape. He's frozen on the spot with his lance standing straight up there in the wood, and he does not move as he stares deeper and deeper and deeper into the 3 drops of blood, remembering what he left behind when he left on this journey to look for his mother all of that time ago. Deeper and deeper into the trance, and no one knows how long Parzival sat there. No one knows how long Parzival stared into this divination board of snow and blood and goose, into the scape of his own love there, alone in the wasteland. But in that time that Parzival was there in a trance, they finally, the knights who had been searching, finally came upon him. Now, a strange thing happens in these stories, that almost every time a knight that no one recognizes is seen, the first move is attack. And so the first move here, when the knights ride up on Parzival, they're looking for a red knight. I assume his armor's still red, but for some reason they attack him, and the first knight that goes out to attack Parzival, his name is Segramor. And Segramor gets onto his horse and rides at this frozen knight, staring into the snow with his lance erect there, and rides at him full speed. And at the last second, barely taking his eyes off of the 3 drops of blood in the snow, Parzival couches his lance and dethrones Segramor, taking only a blow on the shield. His shield, which is already rent from his battle with Aurelius, now having 2 holes now from this incredible joust with Segramor, this frozen trance joust. And Segramor is dethroned, or dehorsed. Not dethroned, that's interesting. Dehorsed. And walks back to camp, complaining. Who is this knight? This knight out there in the woods, and he threw me off my horse, but, it's someone else's problem now. And so Kay, Arthur's brother, gets upon his horse and rides out to defend the honor of the Round Table against this errant knight, this errant knave out there in the woods who seems to be just throwing men from their horses. But Kay feels confident, and so he gets on his war horse and his armor, and he rides at full speed towards Parzival. Full speed, the drumming of the hooves getting closer and closer and closer, the fury of Kay there, driving at him at full speed, and only at the last second before the impact of the lance on shield does Parzival move at all, barely lifting his eyes from the drops of blood in the snow, and flicking his lance and dehorsing Kai there off of his horse. And in the tumble off of his horse, Kay breaks his arm and his leg. And ever after this, Kay was the one who was left home to be the seneschal, the homekeeper at Camelot. And it was all because of Parzival throwing him off of the horse there in the wood. And so Kay can't walk back, and so he's carried back to his tent. He's carried back to his tent by attendants, and he's laid down there. And Gawain comes in. You might have heard his name Gawain, but Gawain comes in and talks to Kay and says, "What happened? How did you get dethroned? You're one of the best knights in all the land, and now you're here. What happened?" And they begin to unfold it, and instead of speaking about it kindly and trying to come up with a plan, Kay begins to lambast Gawain. He says, "Gawain, a single thread of hair could hold your hands back from a fight. You are a soft lad, and you never fight. So you're the last person I want to talk to. Go get Lancelot. Go get somebody who's going to go out there and do something." And Gawain refuses to be baited into a battle with an injured person, a person with an injured body and injured pride, and listens to Kay go on and on and on, and then leaves. And instead of mounting his horse in full regalia, with his sword and his lance and his shield and his armor, Gawain gets onto his horse in his simple plain clothes, with his forest green silk cape, and rides into the woods where this knight is sitting. This knight that no one knows is Parzival except for Parzival, who might not even know who he is at this point. He's so deep into this trance, this love trance. And Gawain, with his subtlety and his willingness to look at the situation before running in, recognizes the love trance. He sees the particular flick of the eye and the shimmering of space around this knight stuck there, this frozen knight in the frozen landscape, staring into the white snow with the 3 drops of blood. And he takes off his green silk cape, and with one last look throws it gently in the snow, covering the 3 drops of blood. And Parzival is released from the trance. And Gawain introduces himself, and he tells him who he is and why he's here. And then Parzival introduces himself, and suddenly Gawain recognizes him and sees the red armor and realizes, you're the reason that we're here. We found you. And he picks up Parzival, and Parzival and Gawain go back. They join the party. They enter into the feasting and this wildling round table out there in the wasteland that has been set up by Arthur. And Parzival is finally invited to join the company of knights. And there's great feasting and boasting and drinking. And almost for a second, Parzival forgets the grief of the wasteland and the condemning words of the voice and the condemning words of his cousin and all of the horrors he's seen in the intervening time. He almost forgets as he's brought into this glowing golden bosom of the court there for the first time, this thing that he's longed for since boyhood. And at that moment, something rides in to the court. Something rides into this outdoor festival of immensity. And that something is named Kundry. And Kundry is a woman of the woods, and they say that Kundry was tall, giant tall, and that she had hair that was thick and spiky like boar's bristles that hung all the way down her back in a long plait. That her eyebrows were so long that she would braid them and tuck them behind her ears. They say that she had the ears of a black bear and the nose of a pig and teeth like lion's teeth and long pointed chiseled claws. And the one most incredible thing about Kundry is she always wore the most incredible hats. She was very much into haberdashery. She wore nice hats over her incredibly strange, wild countenance, and she rode in to this wild court out there in the woods. And she rides right up to Arthur, her horse's nose dribbling right in front of Arthur down onto the table, and she rides up and she says, "Today, Arthur, you have dragged the round table into excrement. You have shamed your whole lineage. There's nothing about you that is worth remembering after what you have done today. You inviting that Red Knight to sit at this table. That boy thinks that he can wear Ithir's armor and live up to Ithir's status in the world when he wasn't even able to ask a single question of the Grail King. Did he tell you? Have you talked to him yet? He failed. He was given the greatest gift. He was invited into the presence of the Grail, and he said nothing. He was mute and quiet and lacking compassion. She just rips Parzival open. She rips him open. And this moment of finally arriving at his boyhood dream is torn to shatters and tatters in the perfectly valid tearing apart of his failure out loud in front of everyone. And again, he leaves. He gets on his horse. He gets on his horse and he leaves. He leaves in the face of this tension of his actions having consequences. And he leaves, and at the last second, Gawain calls out to him, "May God be with you." And Parzival yells back, "What good is God?" as he rides off into the woods, alone, again, back into the darkness of the wasteland in his cold red armor. It is said after that that Parzival became a sellsword, that he went across vast oceans and fought in bloody campaigns, that he haunted the woods in his times when he was there in Logres, that he learned about the grime and the grief of living on the outside in the loneliness, that he never took off his armor and was so cold. And it was not until one Good Friday that Parzival was riding through the woods that he came upon a group of pilgrims. And the youngest among them, the daughter of these two pilgrims, said to him, "You look so cold. You look so cold. Won't you join us on this pilgrimage to this hermit's cell? Won't you join us to go and celebrate this miracle that we're going to celebrate?" And ever since that moment with Gawain, Parzival has been in some internal war with God. And he refuses in that moment. He refuses the hospitality of these pilgrims, and he leaves, but he only gets just out of sight. He only lets the pilgrims move away until he realizes that that is what he needs. He needs hospitality, and he needs mercy, and he needs grace, and so he turns around and he goes to the hermit's cell once everyone's gone. And he gets off his horse and he enters. And he stays there with this hermit in the woods. And this hermit's name is Tresvizant. And Tresvizant unfolds to him some small sliver of the mystery, some full-hearted, graceful mercy there in this cell in the woods. And this young man now, so well tutored in the art of chivalry, skilled in the art of causing grief, chiseled and threshed by his time in the wasteland, is given this great gift of a heart of grace and spirit by this new mentor. And this mentor speaks to him at some point, begins to speak to him about the Grail and about the mystery of the Grail and the origins of the Grail and the tensions between God and the devil that the Grail plays within. And then he begins to speak to him of the Grail Castle and the Grail King and the great wound in the Grail King that was caused by the spear of Longinus, which was brought to England by Joseph of Arimathea after it was used to stab Christ on the cross, and the origins of the Grail and how it was brought to England again by Joseph of Arimathea. And it was the only thing that fed Joseph of Arimathea during his long imprisonment. And these incredible mysteries, and he speaks to him about how the Grail is the only thing that keeps the Fisher King alive. And in fact, the Fisher King's wound hurts worse when Saturn is on the rise in the east. Interestingly enough, conjunct with the moon today here. But Anfortas, the Grail King's wound, burns when Saturn is rising. And then Parzival reveals who he is. He says that he's Parzival. And he says only when there's this moment where the mystery gets deeper and deeper and deeper, and Tresvizant tells him that there's this prophecy about this, this knight who will go and receive and actually attain the Grail, and how the boy came to the castle and failed the test, and Parzival admits that it's him. And Tresvizant tells him, after he reveals who he is, he says, "Well, I am your uncle. I am your mother's brother." And Anfortas, or Pelas or Pellinor, depending on who we want him to be, the Fisher King is also your uncle because he is my brother too. And we know you failed. And unfortunately, your mother is dead. And he just unfolds he gets this one emanation from his family after all of these years, and he's both grieved and accepted by this mentor there in the woods. Just such an incredible, beautiful thing. Them there sharing in the mystery, and them there sharing in the family together. And adventure calls again, because now Parzival knows that there's a prophecy. There's this prophecy about him. that he will attain the Grail. And he doesn't know how it's going to happen. And he rides off into the world to search for adventure. And again, the strange thing about this kingdom is that when two knights meet each other that don't know each other, the first thought they have is attack. And so he's riding through the woods, and suddenly he peers and he sees a green knight up there off in the distance. And they both lock eyes, and they drop lance, and they charge at each other. And just as the two are about to slam into each other, the squire of the Green Knight yells out, "Gawain! Gawain! Gawain! It's Parzival! Stop! Stop what you're doing!" And they lift lance. They listen to the squire. They hear his tiny little voice over the thundering of the hooves and the creaking of steel and the rise of adrenaline. And they stop this fight. And Gawain's name means the Hawk of May. And so the hawk and Parzival, who's a little bit more like a crow now, meet there in the woods, and they embrace. Because and they unfold their stories, and they unfold that after Parzival had run away, Kundry turned on Gawain and began to lambaste his honor for some other failed misadventure in the Grail Castle that he had never told anyone about in front of everyone, and how Gawain had then left the Round Table as well and gone to wander the wasteland on his own and regain his own sense of honor. Reunited there, they join up and they begin this circumnavigation, this tracking of their destiny, finding their great star rising together. And one day they come to the coast of the island, and they see a great ship, unlike any ship they have ever seen, there landed on the coast. And as they approach, they see a knight, unlike any knight that they've ever seen, some knight who smells of eastern spices and carries a great curved-bladed sword. And the pattern fulfills itself again, and battle ensues between Parzival and this knight there on the beach. And they fight, and they're perfectly matched. And they fight, and this curved sword flashes through the air in ways that Parzival has never seen. But he holds his own against this knight, until he sees one moment when he sees the sword slowing and the guard opening, and he pulls back his sword and with all his might thrusts it within the defenses of this knight, going for a stab, a kill, the ending of this great perfectly matched fight. And at the last second, the curved blade flicks back across and shatters Parzival's longsword, which he received from the Fisher King. He shatters the Angler King's sword there in pieces, ringing, falling into the sand. And the knight this knight with the curved sword drops his weapon, puts it away, and he says, "Well, there's no honor in killing an unarmed man, and I'll tell you this now. If your sword would not have broken, I believe you would have bested me. What is your name?" And Parzival refuses to give his name. And instead of meeting this distrust and this distance with distance, the knight there says, "My name is Ferfez, and I am the son of Gaumaret, and I am here to meet with him. And tonight we didn't say it because I got caught up in the quickness, but Parzival's father's name is Gaumaret. And Farfez is Parzival's brother from Baghdad. And the only two things that Parzival ever knew about his brother were that his name was Ferfez, and that he had skin that was mottled black and white. Some called him the Magpie Knight. And so when Farfez takes off his helmet and reveals his mottled black and white skin, Parzival breaks down in grief and reveals who he is, and that they indeed are brothers, both sons of Gomeret, from different mothers in different lands and different times. Because Farfez is from Baghdad, and he's here looking for his father. And so Parzival unfolds the story and tells him of his father's death on the Baghdad Road all those years ago. And they embrace, and then Gawain comes, and the three embrace, and Gawain can't help but fall for the charm of Farfez, and they bring him to Arthur, and they bring him to the Round Table. And they have an incredible feast, and everyone falls for the charm of Parzival's brother, and Parzival almost forgets his loneliness, his weariness, his wandering, what it was like the last time he was here and had his honor stripped bare there by Kundry's words, when a hooded black figure, a black hooded figure rides in on a horse. This time, her horse's nose right up to Parzival, dripping onto the table in front of him. And she pulls back her hood and she reveals herself, Kundry, the woman of the woods, again, with her pleated eyebrows and her long spiky boar hair and her tusks and her pig nose and her bear's ears and her grating woody voice. And she says, Parzival, I bring you good news. You are being invited. You are being invited back to the Grail Castle. Mystery. What happened to Parzival? But Parzival, you are being invited back to the Grail Castle. The Angler King requests, your uncle requests your attendance. And you may bring one person with you. While in the joys of having met his brother for the first time, he obviously chooses him. And the Magpie Knight from Baghdad and Parzival, the Grief Crow of England, and Kundry, the Wild Woman of the Woods, ride together from where Arthur's court is housed at the time, through the woods and back, deep into the wasteland, into Wild Mountain. And they are sat there at a feast, the Angler King on his Diaz and his bleeding wound. And he addresses Parzival and he says, the last time you were here, Parzival, you caused me so much grief in your silence. Your lack of compassion, your inability to be with me in what ails me. I hope that you will not repeat that this time. And Parzival, tears streaming down his face in the company of his brother, sat next to Kundry, says, my uncle, what ails you? What is your grief? Why are you suffering? And the question rings like magic, like a spell in the air. It quivers like a bell. And the change is almost instantaneous. Life returns to the Fisher King's face. The bird song returns to the woods outside of the castle. The sound of burbling water in creeks and springs and wells returns. The smell of the wound, but also the land, dissipates in an instant as life returns. As life returns in the face of the question, in the face of the compassion and the grace of asking for one's grief. And it is said that Parzival became the Grail Lord. the king of the Grail, and that the Fisher King was free, and that Cynwyrmers came and arrived at the Grail Castle only mere hours later, accompanied by 2 boys who had been conceived the day before Parzival left on his journey to go find his mother, and now were older children becoming young men longing for their father. And they embraced, and they were reunited. And in this attaining of the Grail, this wasteland became a flower of a kingdom. And this royal road between Camelot, between the center and the realm of mystery, was maintained for as many years as we could count. And all was beautiful, and all was filled with grace. And that is the end of that story. Just let it sit in the air for a second. And, the practice that I do here is that I've learned. I learned through Martin Shaw, but he learned from Danny Deardorff, this incredible storyteller that passed some years ago, is to feed a story, because there's a way in which stories are bred. They're like food. They feed us in image, and in meaning, and in connection, and living things, right? And that stories are alive, and living things get hungry, and they need to eat. And sometimes when we don't feed stories, they decide to eat us, and then you find yourself living out stories that maybe you weren't wanting to live out. So the practice is to feed a story what it is, give it what it is, and so to connect, to find in yourself one image that's with you, that's romping around in your landscape of your heart and your mind and your space, and then to give it breath, to speak it out loud. And since we're all here on Zoom, you can use the chat function if you want, but if you want to speak the image that's with you out loud, we can just make a space for a couple minutes for that. Feel free to unmute yourself. Thanks.
Just those drops of blood.
The night who smelled like spice.
Parzival, the grief crow of England.
Full-hearted, graceful mercy in a cell.
The spear of Longinus really just, I can't, that weeping spear is really stuck with me. Yeah, Alexis, the horse's nose dribbling on the table. Where did that come from?
The voice of the squire ringing out, being heard.
These knights who can't stop fighting each other right away.
The way I heard it, the redemption of Parzival and through compassion was healing both forwards and backwards in time.
I love that. I feel that way too. Well, any last dwellers on the threshold images that want to make their way? Oh, we've got to. Oh, there we go. That's beautiful. Wow. I deeply, deeply appreciate you all for making time for this, for making time for stories in your lives, and for, being with us here in the, what feels like it's like a wildling round table out here in the woods with us. Maybe we're doing something right, is what I hope. And yeah, I just thank you for your magic. It's not possible without you. Maybe it is, but it wouldn't be the same. So, deep blessings on your night. Email me if you have any super weird dreams. I love to hear about these stories becoming weird dreams. Yeah, and if you want to drop me a line if you want to get on the mailing list if you're not on there, or we've also got a Discord channel where we're talking about some stuff and trying to connect. We might do a book club. Lots of things brewing. So let me know, and all the love until next time.
Thanks, Chase.
You're welcome, bud. Thanks for coming. Get some sleep.